This incident is from a sprawling, suffocatingly humid, antebellum estate completely isolated on the edge of the swamplands in Savannah, Georgia. There is an old, unspoken rule among the aristocratic families of the deep American South: you never truly know the blood you are bringing into your home until the sun goes down. People can hide their flaws, their debts, and their sins behind a beautiful face and a charming smile. But you cannot hide the dark. The dark has a scent. It has a temperature. It has a gravity that warps the very air in a room. My name is Eleanor. I am the sole owner of Blackwood Manor, a massive, isolated estate sitting on the very edge of the Georgia swamplands. The house is over 2 centuries old, built with heavy oak and iron, surrounded by towering cypress trees choking on thick, gray Spanish moss. I have lived in this house my entire life. I know every creaking floorboard, every drafty window, and every shadow cast by the Georgia moon. I thought my home was an impenetrable fortress. But I didn't realize that the devil doesn't need to break down your front door if your own flesh and blood invites him inside. The nightmare began in the suffocating heat of July, exactly 2 years ago. My son, Julian, was the center of my universe. He was a highly successful architect working in New York City. He was pragmatic, logical, and entirely focused on his career. He had never been the type to make rash, emotional decisions. That is why, when he called me on a Tuesday evening to tell me he had eloped with a woman he had known for less than 3 weeks, I felt a sudden, icy knot twist deep in my stomach. "Her name is Evelyn, Mother," Julian had said over the phone, his voice sounding oddly strained, almost hollow. "She's beautiful. We're coming down to Savannah for a week so you can meet her before I have to fly to London for a project." When they arrived at Blackwood Manor 2 days later, the air in the estate physically changed. I was standing on the grand wraparound porch, waiting to greet my new daughter-in-law. When Julian opened the passenger door of his town car, Evelyn stepped out into the humid afternoon sun. She was, objectively, striking. She had long, jet-black hair that fell in a severe, straight line down her back, and skin so pale and flawless it looked like polished porcelain. But there was something fundamentally, horrifyingly wrong with her. It was her eyes. They were a pale, washed-out blue, but they were completely vacant. They lacked the micro-movements, the subtle shifting of focus that living people possess. When she looked at me, I felt the sensation of being stared at by a taxidermy animal. "Welcome to Blackwood, Evelyn," I said, forcing a warm, aristocratic smile. I stepped forward to embrace her. As my arms wrapped around her slender shoulders, a violent, freezing shockwave shot through my chest. Despite the sweltering 90-degree Georgia heat, Evelyn's skin was ice cold. It was the exact temperature of meat left in a butcher's freezer. Furthermore, she carried a scent that completely overpowered my expensive perfume. It was the heavy, metallic smell of old copper coins, mixed with the sickeningly sweet scent of dried lavender and stagnant, muddy water. She didn't hug me back. She simply stood completely rigid, staring over my shoulder into the dark, open doorway of the manor. "It's very old," Evelyn whispered. Her voice was monotone, raspy, and completely devoid of emotion. "Old houses hide so many dead things. I pulled away, unnerved, looking at Julian for an explanation. But my son didn't look like a happy, newlywed groom. He looked exhausted. He had deep, dark bags under his eyes, his skin looked sallow, and his hands were trembling slightly as he grabbed their heavy leather luggage from the trunk. It was as if something was slowly, methodically draining his vitality. "Let's get inside," Julian muttered, not making eye contact with me. That evening, the true, supernatural horror of my new daughter-in-law began to manifest. We were sitting in the grand dining room. Marcus, my elderly groundskeeper and estate caretaker, was pouring wine into our heavy crystal glasses. Julian was picking at his food, completely silent, while Evelyn simply stared at the massive, antique grandfather clock ticking in the corner of the room. "Evelyn, Julian tells me you are originally from the countryside," I said, desperately trying to cut through the suffocating, awkward silence. "Do you have family back home?" Evelyn didn't blink. She slowly turned her head toward me. "Family rots in the dirt just like everyone else." I froze, my fork hovering halfway to my mouth. Julian suddenly stood up, knocking his heavy oak chair backward. "I have a headache," he blurted out, wiping his sweating forehead. "I need to lie down. I have an early flight to London tomorrow." "Excuse me." He practically ran out of the dining room, leaving me completely alone with her. The silence that followed was agonizing. The only sound was the rhythmic, heavy tick-tock of the grandfather clock. Marcus stepped forward to clear Julian's untouched plate. As his hand brushed against Evelyn's wine glass, he accidentally knocked it over. The deep red wine spilled across the pristine white lace tablecloth, looking exactly like a pooling blood stain. "I am so sorry, Miss Evelyn," Marcus stammered, frantically grabbing a cloth napkin to soak up the spill. "My hands aren't as steady as they used to be." Evelyn looked down at the stain, and then slowly looked up at Marcus. Her pale blue eyes seemed to darken, the pupils dilating until they almost swallowed her irises. "Your hands shake because your bones are weak," Evelyn hissed. Her voice suddenly dropped a full octave, carrying a metallic, reverberating echo that sounded like two voices speaking at the exact same time. "If you do not leave this room, your bones will shatter." I stood up, absolutely outraged. "Evelyn, you will not speak to my staff that way. Marcus has been a part of this family for 30 years. Apologize to him this instant." Evelyn didn't look at me. She kept her dead, unblinking gaze fixed on the terrified old man. "Leave the room, old man," Evelyn commanded, the dual voice vibrating so heavily that the crystal chandelier above us began to softly chime. "Or the ceiling will crush you." "That is enough," I roared. "Marcus, go to the kitchen. I will handle this." Marcus didn't need to be told twice. He turned and practically sprinted toward the swinging kitchen doors. But as Marcus crossed the threshold of the dining room, a deafening, explosive sound echoed through the manor. It sounded like a cannon firing inside the house. Directly above where Marcus had been standing just 2 seconds prior, the massive, 300-pound crystal and wrought iron chandelier violently detached from the reinforced ceiling. The thick iron chain snapped as if it were made of cheap twine. The colossal fixture plummeted, crashing into the center of the dining room table with apocalyptic force. Thousands of razor-sharp shards of crystal exploded outward like shrapnel. The heavy oak table splintered, collapsing under the immense weight. I was thrown backward, screaming as the shockwave knocked me to the floor. Dust, plaster, and shattered glass rained down over the dining room. I crawled backward, gasping for air, coughing on the thick cloud of pulverized drywall. I looked up, expecting to see Evelyn crushed beneath the debris. But she was completely unharmed. Evelyn was sitting perfectly still in her chair. The chandelier had completely annihilated the table around her, but not a single piece of glass, not a single speck of dust, had touched her. She looked down at me, her face completely expressionless. "I told him the ceiling would crush him," she whispered. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't an architectural failure. My new daughter-in-law had spoken a threat, and the physical reality of the house had violently altered itself to make her words come true. She had the black tongue. She was a living, breathing hex. The next morning, the terror compounded. Julian was standing in the grand foyer, his suitcase packed, completely oblivious to the near-fatal disaster that had occurred the night before, having apparently slept through the deafening crash, a fact I found impossible, but he claimed he had taken heavy sleeping pills. I begged him not to leave. I grabbed his arm, pulling him into the study, tears streaming down my face. "Julian, you cannot leave me alone with that woman," I pleaded, my voice trembling. "Something is wrong with her. Something is demonic." The chandelier, Julian, it fell exactly when she said it would. Marcus was almost killed. Julian rubbed his temples, looking incredibly pale and sickly. "Mother, stop it. You're being dramatic. It's a 200-year-old house. The ceiling chain rusted out. It was a coincidence." "Julian, her skin is freezing. She speaks in two voices. Please, listen to me. I don't have time for your aristocratic paranoia, Mother," Julian snapped, pulling his arm away with surprising force. "I am going to London for my firm. Evelyn will stay here for the week. Treat my wife with respect, or I won't come back." He walked out of the study, kissed Evelyn on her ice-cold cheek, and got into the waiting town car. As the car drove down the long, gravel driveway, I realized with absolute, horrifying clarity that I was now entirely trapped in an isolated mansion with a monster. The true nature of what I was dealing with revealed itself on the third night of Julian's absence. By this point, I was living in a state of constant, suffocating terror. Evelyn rarely left the master suite on the second floor. She didn't eat. She didn't drink. Whenever I walked past her bedroom door, the ambient temperature in the hallway would drop so severely that frost would form on the brass doorknobs. Marcus refused to enter the house. He slept in the groundskeeper's cabin near the edge of the swamp, terrified of the woman with the dead eyes. It was 3 a.m. A violent, torrential Georgia thunderstorm had rolled in off the coast. Lightning flashed through the massive bay windows, casting long, skeletal shadows across the hardwood floors. The thunder was deafening, shaking the very foundations of Blackwood Manor. I woke up feeling an intense, burning thirst. I put on my silk robe and crept out of my bedroom, making my way toward the grand staircase to get a glass of water from the kitchen. To reach the stairs, I had to walk past the master suite where Evelyn was staying. As I approached her heavy mahogany door, the air grew instantly, paralyzingly cold. I could see my breath pluming in thick white clouds in the darkness of the hallway. The smell of rotting earth and stagnant swamp water was so overpowering that I had to cover my nose and mouth with the sleeve of my robe to keep from gagging. And then, over the roar of the thunderstorm outside, I heard a sound that froze the blood in my veins. Evelyn was talking. But she wasn't talking in her sleep. She was having a full, animated conversation. I crept closer, pressing my ear against the cold wood of the bedroom door. "He will be ready soon," Evelyn's raspy voice whispered. "His body is strong. It will hold you much longer than the last one." My stomach plummeted. Who is she talking to? Suddenly, a second voice answered her from inside the locked bedroom. It was a man's voice. It was deep, guttural, and vibrated with a horrifying, metallic echo. It didn't sound like a human being speaking through vocal cords. It sounded like stones grinding together at the bottom of a deep well. "The mother knows," the demonic voice rumbled, the sheer bass of the sound vibrating the wooden floorboards beneath my feet. "She is watching. She is trying to sever the tie. We must silence her." "I will break her mind," Evelyn replied, her tone completely flat and detached. "I will make her swallow glass." Tears of absolute, unadulterated terror streamed down my face. She wasn't alone in there. There was a man in her room. No, not a man. An entity. A demon. Driven by a desperate, frantic need to protect my son and my home, I slowly reached down and turned the brass doorknob. It wasn't locked. I pushed the door open just a crack, peering into the pitch-black master suite. A flash of lightning illuminated the room for a fraction of a second, and what I saw in that brief flash of light will haunt me until the day I die. Evelyn was sitting cross-legged in the dead center of the king-sized bed. She was wearing a sheer white nightgown. Standing directly behind her, looming over the bed, was a shadow. It was an impossible, towering figure, at least 7 feet tall, completely devoid of any physical features. It was a silhouette of pure, pitch-black void, darker than the unlit room around it. The entity had massive, elongated arms that draped down over Evelyn's shoulders, its spectral, claw-like hands gently caressing her face. The entity wasn't a separate ghost haunting her. It was attached to her. She was its vessel, its anchor to the physical world. As the lightning faded, plunging the room back into darkness, the towering shadow slowly turned its featureless head toward the doorway. Toward me. "I see you, old woman," the grinding, demonic voice echoed, not from the room, but directly inside my own skull. I didn't scream. My throat was completely paralyzed by fear. I pulled the door shut, scrambled backward down the hallway, and locked myself inside my own bedroom, pushing a heavy oak dresser against the door. I sat on the floor, clutching my chest, hyperventilating as the thunderstorm raged outside. Julian hadn't just married a strange, rude girl. He had married a conduit for a demonic parasite. And this entity didn't just want Julian's money, or his estate. It was preparing to take his body. And if I didn't find a way to stop it, The shadow behind my daughter-in-law was going to ensure that neither my son nor I would survive the week. The human mind is incredibly fragile. When confronted with the impossible, with a terror so profound that it shatters your fundamental understanding of reality, your brain attempts to build a fortress of rationalization. You tell yourself it was just the wind. You tell yourself the shadows were just tricks of the light. You tell yourself that the demonic, grinding voice you heard in the dead of night was just a symptom of sleep deprivation. But as the sun rose over the suffocating, humid swamplands of Savannah the next morning, my fortress of rationalization completely collapsed. I knew, with a sickening, bone-deep certainty, that the shadow I had seen hovering over Evelyn was real. Blackwood Manor, my sanctuary for over 60 years, had been breached. I was living with a parasite that was wearing my daughter-in-law like a custom-made suit. I locked myself in my bedroom for most of the morning, pacing the hardwood floors, my mind racing with absolute, paralyzing panic. Julian was in London. He was safe, separated from this monster by an entire ocean. I just needed to survive the week. I needed to figure out how to force her out of my home without triggering the terrifying power of her black tongue. But Evelyn was not content to simply wait. The entity attached to her was hungry, and it began to stretch its dark, violent influence over the estate. The first true casualty of her curse happened just before noon. I had invited an old family friend, Arthur Harrison, to the manor. Arthur was a retired judge, a pragmatic, fiercely logical man who had known Julian since he was a child. I hadn't told him about the demon. I knew he would think I was suffering from dementia, but I told him Evelyn was behaving erratically and I felt unsafe. I just wanted someone else in the house. I wanted a witness. Arthur arrived at noon, his heavy boots echoing on the grand staircase as he walked up to the second-floor landing where I was standing. The Georgia heat was oppressive, but the moment Arthur reached the top of the stairs, he stopped, pulling at the collar of his shirt. "Good Lord, Eleanor," Arthur muttered, shivering visibly. "Is your air conditioning broken? It feels like a meat locker up here." Before I could answer, the door to the master suite slowly creaked open. Evelyn stepped out into the hallway. She was wearing a long, black silk dressing gown that dragged across the floorboards. Her jet-black hair was completely unkempt, hanging like a veil over her pale, porcelain face. Her dead, vacant blue eyes locked onto Arthur. The temperature in the hallway plummeted so violently that the moisture in the humid air instantly crystallized, forming a thin layer of frost across the antique hallway mirrors. "Who is this?" Evelyn asked. Her voice was that same flat, emotionless drone, but beneath it, I could hear the faint, metallic reverberation of the entity speaking in unison. "This is Judge Harrison, Evelyn," I said, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to hide it. "He is an old, dear friend of the family. He came to check on me." Arthur, ever the southern gentleman, stepped forward and tipped his hat, though I could see the profound unease radiating from his eyes. He felt the wrongness of her. "It is a pleasure to meet you, Evelyn. Julian is a lucky man." Evelyn didn't blink. She didn't smile. She slowly tilted her head to the side, her neck popping loudly in the dead silence of the hall. "You are an arrogant man, Judge Harrison," Evelyn hissed, the dual voice suddenly vibrating with a sudden, vicious malice. "You walk into a house that does not belong to you, carrying the stench of old cigars and false authority. You think you can protect her from me?" Arthur bristled, his face turning a deep shade of crimson. He was not a man used to being spoken to with such blatant disrespect. "Listen here, young lady. I don't know how you were raised, but in this house, we speak to our elders with respect. You are a guest here." I grabbed Arthur's arm, my fingernails digging into his coat. "Arthur, don't," I whispered frantically. "Please, don't argue with her. Let's just go downstairs." But Arthur pulled away, stepping closer to Evelyn, pointing a finger at her. "Julian warned me you were a bit eccentric, but this is bordering on madness. I think you need to pack your bags and leave until Julian returns." Evelyn stared at his pointing finger. The corners of her pale lips slowly twitched upward into a grotesque, impossible smile. It was a smile completely devoid of humanity. "You stand too close to the edge, old man," Evelyn whispered. The sheer bass of the demonic voice beneath her words rattled the glass in the hallway sconces. "Step back, or the earth will rise up to break your bones." "Arthur, move!" I screamed. But it was too late. The curse had been spoken. Arthur opened his mouth to reply, but his eyes suddenly went wide with absolute, unadulterated terror. He didn't trip. He didn't stumble. It looked as though a massive, invisible hand had violently slammed into the center of his chest. Arthur was thrown backward with terrifying, supernatural force. He flew completely over the heavy mahogany railing of the second-floor landing. I lunged forward, screaming his name, but my fingers only brushed the fabric of his coat. Arthur plummeted 20 feet down into the grand foyer. The sound of his body hitting the solid marble floor was a sickening, wet crack that echoed through the entire mansion. I fell to my knees, sobbing hysterically, looking down through the wooden balusters. Arthur was lying completely motionless on the marble, his limbs twisted at horrifying, unnatural angles. A dark pool of crimson blood was slowly expanding from beneath his head. I looked up at Evelyn. She was staring down at the broken body of the judge, completely unfazed. "I told him his bones would break," she muttered, turning around and slowly walking back into the master suite. The heavy door clicked shut behind her. The ambulance arrived 20 minutes later. I was a shivering, hyperventilating mess. The paramedics managed to stabilize Arthur, but the damage was catastrophic. 6 shattered ribs, a fractured spine, and a massive skull fracture. They loaded him into the back of the ambulance. The local sheriff, a man named Miller, pulled me aside. "Eleanor, what the hell happened up there?" Sheriff Miller asked, shining a flashlight into the dark foyer. "She pushed him," I sobbed, pointing a shaking finger toward the second floor. "My daughter-in-law. She cursed him, and then she threw him over the railing without even touching him. You have to arrest her, Sheriff. You have to get her out of my house." Sheriff Miller looked at me with a mixture of pity and disbelief. Eleanor. I looked at the railing. There's no sign of a struggle. Judge Harrison is 72 years old. He probably just lost his balance and had a dizzy spell. You're in shock. I am not in shock, I roared, grabbing his uniform. There is a monster upstairs. She has the black tongue. She caused the chandelier to fall, and she threw Arthur over the balcony. Please, you have to listen to me. Eleanor, that's enough, the sheriff said gently, prying my hands off his vest. I'm not going to arrest your son's new bride for witchcraft. I'll write this up as an accidental fall. I suggest you take a sedative and get some rest. I'll have a cruiser drive by the estate tonight just to make you feel safe. He walked away, leaving me standing alone on the porch. Worldly authorities could not save me. The police deal in logic, in fingerprints, in physics. They cannot arrest a shadow. They cannot put handcuffs on a demon. By the next afternoon, the estate had become a prison of absolute psychological torture. Marcus, my loyal groundskeeper, was terrified, but he refused to leave me alone in the house. He stayed in the kitchen, brewing pots of strong black coffee, jumping at every creak of the floorboards. Evelyn finally came downstairs for lunch. She sat at the small breakfast table in the kitchen, staring blankly at the wall. Marcus, his hand shaking violently, placed a bowl of hot lentil soup in front of her. Evelyn looked down at the soup. Her expression darkened. She picked up a silver spoon and slowly stirred the broth. There, sitting at the bottom of the bowl, was a single, small black pebble that had somehow slipped through the washing process. It was a tiny, harmless mistake. But to the entity wearing Evelyn's skin, it was an insult that required blood. You feed me dirt, old man, Evelyn hissed, not looking up from the bowl. I am so sorry, Miss Evelyn, Marcus stammered, frantically reaching for the bowl. I'll make a fresh batch immediately. Please, forgive my old eyes. Evelyn slammed her hand down onto the table. The wooden surface cracked under the impossible force of her pale, slender hand. Your eyes are useless, and your lungs are rotting, Evelyn commanded, the demonic resonance vibrating so loudly my ears began to ring. If you try to feed me dirt, you will choke on the filth inside your own chest. You will cough until you drown in the black. Evelyn, stop it. I screamed, rushing forward to shield Marcus. But the words had already left her tongue. The reality of the kitchen immediately warped to fulfill her curse. Marcus staggered backward, his hands flying to his throat. His eyes bulged in absolute terror. He let out a horrifying, wet, rattling cough. But it wasn't a normal cough. It sounded as if his lungs were filling with thick, viscous fluid. He collapsed to his knees, clawing at his own throat, gasping desperately for air. And then, he began to vomit. But he didn't vomit food. Marcus spewed a massive, coagulated stream of pitch-black, putrid mud and thick, tangled human hair onto the pristine kitchen tiles. The stench of stagnant swamp water and rotting flesh instantly filled the kitchen, so overpowering that I fell back against the counter, gagging violently. Marcus," I sobbed, dropping to my knees beside him, trying to wipe the horrific, black sludge from his mouth. "Breathe. Please, God, breathe." Marcus was turning a terrifying shade of violet, choking on the supernatural dirt manifesting inside his own respiratory system. Evelyn stood up from the table, completely unbothered by the men dying in agony at her feet. She walked over to the heavy cast-iron stove, where a large, industrial-grade pressure cooker was boiling water for tea. The steam was whistling aggressively out of the top valve. "This house is too loud," Evelyn muttered, staring at the whistling pot. "The metal will burst to silence the noise." My eyes widened in absolute horror. "No. Get down." I grabbed Marcus by his collar and violently dragged him backward behind the heavy oak kitchen island just as the curse took effect. The pressure cooker didn't just burst. It detonated. A deafening, catastrophic explosion ripped through the kitchen. The heavy cast-iron pot shattered into a dozen pieces of jagged shrapnel, tearing through the wooden cabinets, shattering the kitchen windows, and embedding themselves deep into the drywall. Boiling, scalding water rained down over the entire room, melting the plastic on the counters and burning the hardwood floor. I covered Marcus's body with my own, screaming as a piece of superheated iron grazed my shoulder, tearing through my blouse and searing my flesh. When the deafening ringing in my ears finally subsided, I looked up over the edge of the kitchen island. The kitchen was completely annihilated. The walls were covered in boiling water and black mud. But Evelyn was gone. She had slipped out of the room before the explosion even happened, leaving Marcus and me to die in the crossfire of her curse. I managed to drag Marcus out the back door and onto the lawn. The fresh air finally broke the curse's hold on his lungs. He violently expelled the last of the black mud and gasped, sucking in massive, ragged breaths of oxygen. He was alive, but he was completely broken. I called an ambulance for him, and as they drove him away, I realized I was now entirely, completely alone in Blackwood Manor. I couldn't go to the police. I couldn't run away. This was my family's legacy, and I refused to abandon my home to a parasite. I needed someone who understood the dark. I needed someone who fought the devil for a living. I ran to my study, locked the heavy oak door, and pulled out an old, leather-bound address book. Years ago, my late husband had consulted a man named Father Vance, a rogue, highly unorthodox Catholic priest who specialized in occult archives and severe demonic attachments. He lived in a parish deep in the Louisiana bayou, a man who had seen the ugliest, darkest corners of the spiritual world. I called him, weeping hysterically into the receiver, describing the black mud, the explosive commands, the freezing temperatures, and the towering shadow I had seen in the bedroom. "I'm coming, Eleanor," Father Vance said, his voice grave and heavy. "Do not speak to her. Do not eat anything she touches. Lock yourself in your room. I will be there by nightfall." Father Vance arrived at Blackwood Manor just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the estate in deep, terrifying shadows. He was a tall, rugged man with a thick silver beard, wearing a faded black cassock and carrying a heavy, worn leather medical bag. He didn't walk past the threshold of the front door. He stopped on the porch, closing his eyes and taking a deep breath through his nose. "The stench of the grave is thick here," Father Vance murmured, pulling a small silver vial of holy water from his coat and flicking it across the doorway. The water hissed and steamed as it hit the hardwood floor, reacting to the heavy demonic residue in the house. "You are not dealing with a simple haunting, Eleanor. The air is completely saturated with sulfur and necrotic energy." I ushered him into the locked study, my hands shaking violently. "Father, she is upstairs. She cursed my friend, and he fell. She cursed my groundskeeper, and he coughed up black mud. Her words alter reality. She has the black tongue." Father Vance frowned, setting his heavy bag on my desk. "The black tongue is not a power a human being possesses naturally. It is a symptom. It is the result of a symbiotic demonic attachment. An entity of immense, ancient power has anchored itself to her soul. It uses her vocal cords to issue commands, and the demonic energy manipulates the physical world to make it happen. Do you have any photographs of her? Anything from the wedding?" "Yes." I scrambled to my desk drawer and pulled out a stack of glossy photographs from Julian and Evelyn's rushed wedding ceremony. "Julian sent these to me a week ago. He complained that the photographer did a terrible job because almost all the photos came out blurry." Father Vance took the photos, pulling a pair of reading glasses from his pocket. He spread them out across the mahogany desk, holding a small reading lamp close to the glossy paper. I watched the color completely drain from the old priest's face. "God in heaven," Vance whispered, his hands trembling as he held up a photograph of Julian and Evelyn standing at the altar. I leaned in to look. To the naked eye, the photo just looked underexposed and slightly out of focus. But Father Vance pointed a thick, calloused finger at the space directly behind Evelyn's back. "Look at the light distortion," he said grimly. "Look at the shadows." My heart stopped. In the photograph, the shadows stretching across the floor of the church didn't match the lighting. The shadow trailing behind Evelyn was massive, elongated, and possessed two distinct, claw-like horns rising from its spectral head. But the most horrifying detail was on Julian. In the photograph, an invisible, shadowy hand with long, jagged fingers was resting directly on my son's shoulder, its dark, blurry tendrils wrapping around his neck. "She is not the target," Father Vance said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, absolute whisper. "Evelyn is just the vehicle. The entity attached to her doesn't want her soul. It already owns her. It wants a new, stronger vessel. It wants a male host. It wants your son, Eleanor." "No," I sobbed, covering my mouth. "Julian is in London. He's thousands of miles away. He's safe." "Distance means absolutely nothing to an apex demonic entity," Vance snapped, hurriedly packing his tools. "If it has marked him, it will draw him back. The curse of the Black Tongue is absolute. If she commands him to return, he will walk blindly into his own possession. We have to perform a full, localized exorcism on the anchor, Evelyn, to sever the tie before your son comes back." "How long will that take?" I asked desperately. The ritual of severing requires consecrated elements I must prepare. It will take me 2 days, Vance said, his eyes burning with intense urgency. Eleanor, listen to me very carefully. You must avoid her completely for the next 48 hours. Do not engage her. Do not anger her. And whatever you do, you must contact Julian and tell him that under no circumstances can he return to this house. I nodded frantically, snatching the heavy rotary phone off my desk to call Julian's hotel in London. I dialed the international operator, my fingers slipping on the dial in my panic. Ring. 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 Come on, Julian, pick up, I muttered, tears streaming down my face. The hotel concierge answered. The Savoy Hotel, how may I direct your call? Julian Blackwood, please. It's an absolute emergency. This is his mother. One moment, madam. A minute passed. It felt like an eternity of agonizing silence. Finally, the concierge returned to the line. I am terribly sorry, madam, the man said politely. Mr. Blackwood checked out of his suite abruptly 3 hours ago. He mentioned a family emergency and said he was boarding the first available flight back to Savannah. My blood turned to absolute ice. The phone slipped from my grip, clattering loudly onto the hardwood floor. I looked at Father Vance, a scream of pure, unadulterated terror rising in my throat. Evelyn hadn't been idle in her room. She hadn't been sleeping. The shadow had commanded her to speak, and she had used the black tongue. She had commanded her husband to return. And right now, 30,000 feet in the air, my son was flying back to Blackwood Manor, completely unaware that he was walking directly into the jaws of hell. There is a specific, agonizing kind of torture in waiting for a tragedy you know is coming. When the clock is ticking down to the exact moment your world is going to end, time distorts. Every second stretches into an hour. Every creak of the floorboards sounds like a gunshot. I sat in the grand study of Blackwood Manor, watching the heavy brass pendulum of the grandfather clock swing back and forth, knowing that with every single tick, my son was getting miles closer to the demonic entity waiting to consume him. Father Vance did not waste a single second. The moment we realized Julian was on a flight back to Savannah, the rogue priest transformed my aristocratic home into a spiritual fortress. He moved with the frantic, calculated precision of a soldier preparing for a siege. He hauled heavy canvas bags of coarse, blessed rock salt from his trunk, pouring thick, unbroken lines across every single threshold, window sill, and doorway on the ground floor. He produced ancient, tarnished silver crucifixes, driving heavy iron nails into the drywall to hang them above the archways. The entire time, he muttered heavy, guttural Latin prayers under his breath, his voice a low, continuous rumble that vibrated in my chest. The salt will not stop an entity of this magnitude forever, Father Vance warned, wiping a thick sheen of sweat from his forehead. The air conditioning in the manor had completely failed, yet the ambient temperature in the house was violently fluctuating. One moment it was 90 degrees and suffocatingly humid, the next, a freezing, localized draft would sweep through the halls, smelling of sulfur and wet ash. But it will slow it down. It will create a choke point. When Julian walks through those front doors, the entity will attempt to leave the girl and plunge directly into him. We must intercept the transfer. How do we do that? I asked, my voice barely a whisper, my hand shaking so violently I couldn't hold my teacup. We must find the physical anchor, Vance said, his eyes scanning the dark ceiling toward the second floor. A human soul cannot possess a living vessel for decades without a tether. The entity is anchored to a physical object, a piece of its original remains. A bone, a tooth, a handful of grave dirt. Evelyn brought it into this house. We have to find it, and we have to burn it to ash. I racked my brain, desperately trying to remember the luggage Julian had carried in. She didn't bring much. Just 2 leather suitcases and a small vanity box. But wait. My mind flashed back to the moment I had embraced Evelyn on the porch. When my arms had wrapped around her freezing shoulders, I had felt something hard and heavy beneath the high collar of her silk blouse. She wears a necklace, I gasped, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. A thick, heavy silver locket. It looks ancient, almost rusted closed. She never takes it off. Julian mentioned it was a family heirloom. That is the anchor, Father Vance said, his eyes narrowing. We have to rip it from her neck. Before I could process the terrifying reality of having to physically fight a possessed woman, the heavy, metallic crunch of tires on gravel echoed from outside. I rushed to the bay window, peering through the torrential Georgia rain. A black taxi cab had just pulled up the long, winding driveway. The back door opened, and Julian stepped out into the raging storm. He didn't have his luggage. He wasn't holding an umbrella. He just stood in the freezing downpour, staring blankly at the front doors of Blackwood Manor. He looked completely dead inside. His skin was a ghastly, sallow gray, and his arms hung limply at his sides. He was already in a deep, supernatural trance, pulled across the Atlantic Ocean by the irresistible, magnetic gravity of the Black Tongue. Julian! I screamed, running toward the heavy mahogany front doors. Eleanor, wait! Vance roared, grabbing my arm. Do not break the salt line. The heavy brass handle of the front door slowly turned from the outside. The door creaked open, letting the howling wind and the freezing rain tear into the grand foyer. Julian stepped over the threshold. He didn't look at me. His eyes were rolled slightly back into his head, exposing the whites beneath his irises. He walked with a stiff, jerky, unnatural gait, like a marionette being pulled by invisible, cruel strings. Julian, please, look at me. It's your mother. I sobbed, standing safely behind the thick line of salt Vance had poured across the foyer. Julian ignored me completely. He slowly turned his head and looked up toward the top of the grand staircase. There, standing on the second-floor landing, was Evelyn. She was wearing her long, sheer white nightgown. Her jet-black hair clung to her pale, porcelain face. The temperature in the foyer instantly plummeted to absolute zero. The rain blowing in through the open door froze midair, clattering to the hardwood floor as tiny shards of ice. But Evelyn was not alone. The towering, featureless shadow I had seen in her bedroom was now fully manifested behind her, standing perfectly visible in the dim light of the hallway sconces. It was a massive, pitch-black void, radiating an aura of pure, unadulterated hatred. It had its elongated, clawed hands wrapped tightly around Evelyn's throat. Evelyn slowly opened her mouth. Her jaw unhinged, dropping unnaturally low to her collarbone. "The vessel is here," the dual, grinding, demonic voice erupted from her throat. It was deafening. It rattled the picture frames on the walls and shattered the glass bulbs in the chandelier above us. "The flesh is mine." Julian took a slow, robotic step toward the bottom of the stairs. "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, I command you to halt." Father Vance bellowed, stepping directly in front of Julian, raising a heavy silver crucifix high into the air. The reaction was apocalyptic. Evelyn's head snapped toward the priest with impossible, neck-breaking speed. She let out a sonic, ear-piercing shriek that literally brought me to my knees. It sounded like tearing metal and screaming animals. With a violent flick of her pale wrist, Evelyn used the black tongue. "The priest will bleed." The curse warped reality instantly. The heavy, antique grandfather clock in the corner of the foyer violently exploded. A massive shard of splintered oak and shattered glass shot across the room like a bullet, slicing a deep, jagged gash across Father Vance's cheek and shoulder. Vance staggered backward, blood pouring down his face, soaking his collar. But he did not drop the crucifix. He gritted his teeth, his eyes burning with absolute, unwavering faith, and began loudly reciting the rite of exorcism in booming, thunderous Latin. "Exorcismus te, omnis emunt spiritus, omnis satanica potestas, omnis incursio infernalis adversarii." The words struck the entity like physical blows. Evelyn convulsed violently, grabbing her head as if her skull was splitting open. The towering shadow behind her thrashed and roared in agony, the thick smell of sulfur and burning hair flooding the foyer. "Shut up, old man," the demon shrieked from Evelyn's mouth, the voice echoing down the staircase. "You cannot cast me out. I am not an invader. She invited me. She kept my bones. Who are you?" Vance roared back over the howling storm. "Name yourself to the light." Evelyn stumbled down the first 3 steps, her body jerking unnaturally. The shadow clung to her back, its dark tendrils wrapped around her spine. "My name is Silas," the entity growled, the voice vibrating with decades of buried, rotting rage. "I was murdered in this wretched swamp 40 years ago. They beat me. They left my body to rot in the mud because I loved a woman above my station. My flesh decayed, but my anger didn't. I wandered the black water until this stupid, fragile little girl found my bones." I gasped in horror. Evelyn hadn't just been possessed recently. This entity had been inside her for a very long time. She was just a child, Silas gloated, a wet, rattling laugh escaping Evelyn's lips. 5 years old, playing in the deep woods. She picked up my locket from the mud, and I took her. I have lived inside her skin for 20 years, waiting for the perfect male host. I have kept her alive, I have kept her beautiful, just so I could use her to find a man with wealth and power. And Julian. Julian is perfect. When I take his body, I will finally live again. Julian, run! I screamed, lunging forward and grabbing my son's arm. Julian's skin was freezing. He didn't react to my touch. He just kept staring blankly at Evelyn, taking another slow, mechanical step toward the stairs. "Eleanor, the locket!" Father Vance yelled, wiping the blood from his eyes. "He is trying to initiate the transfer. I cannot hold him back much longer. You have to rip the locket off her neck." I looked at the monster walking down the stairs. The sheer, paralyzing terror gripping my heart told me to run, to hide, to save myself. But the primal, maternal love for my son overrode every single survival instinct in my body. I let go of Julian. I screamed, charging blindly up the grand staircase directly toward the possessed woman. "Die, old woman!" Evelyn shrieked, raising her hand to curse me. But Father Vance didn't give her the chance. He plunged his hand into his heavy leather bag, pulled out a glass vial of consecrated water from the River Jordan, and hurled it directly at Evelyn. The holy water struck her squarely in the chest. It exploded in a cloud of searing, white-hot steam. Evelyn let out an agonizing, unearthly wail as the holy water burned through her silk nightgown, scorching the demonic energy beneath her skin. The towering shadow behind her violently flickered, temporarily losing its grip on reality. I didn't hesitate. I tackled Evelyn on the stairs. We crashed hard onto the wooden steps. The physical strength of the possessed woman was terrifying. Evelyn's pale, freezing hands shot up, her fingers wrapping around my throat with the force of a hydraulic press. I choked, my vision instantly blurring with black spots, as she squeezed the life out of me. "I will snap your neck like a dry twig," Silas roared from her mouth, her eyes glowing with an infernal, hateful light. I couldn't breathe. My ribs were screaming in agony. But I didn't try to pull her hands away from my throat. I used both of my hands to grab the collar of her nightgown, violently tearing the fabric downward. There it was. Resting against her pale, freezing collarbone was a heavy, rusted silver locket on a thick iron chain. I grabbed the locket. The metal was so unnaturally cold it literally burned the skin off my palms. I squeezed my eyes shut, gripped the rusted silver with everything I had, and pulled backward with all of my body weight. The thick iron chain dug into Evelyn's neck, cutting the skin, before finally snapping with a loud, metallic crack. For the moment the locket tore free from her body, Evelyn's hands released my throat. She let out a scream that didn't sound human. It was a piercing, apocalyptic screech of pure, unadulterated agony. Thick, putrid black smoke began to violently erupt from her mouth, nose, and eyes. The towering shadow attached to her back was suddenly, aggressively ripped away, hovering in the air above the staircase, roaring in fury as its physical anchor was severed. I tumbled backward down the stairs, clutching the freezing silver locket to my chest, gasping desperately for air. "Burn it!" Father Vance bellowed, rushing forward. I threw the locket onto the hardwood floor of the foyer. Father Vance brought the heavy, iron-heeled sole of his boot down directly onto the rusted silver. The locket shattered open. Inside, a small pile of gray, putrefied bone dust and a lock of rotting hair spilled out onto the floor. Father Vance quickly doused the bone dust in highly flammable, consecrated holy oil, struck a heavy wooden match, and threw it onto the pile. The reaction was instantaneous. The bone dust ignited in a blinding, explosive pillar of emerald green fire. The flames shot 10 feet into the air, scorching the ceiling of the foyer. Above us on the staircase, the towering shadow of Silas froze. The entity arched its back, letting out a final, deafening roar that shattered the remaining windows in the manor. The green fire from the burning anchor shot upward, completely engulfing the astral projection of the demon. Silas burned. The dark, necrotic magic holding his soul to this earth was violently, aggressively annihilated. The shadow twisted and writhed, its spectral claws tearing at its own burning face, before finally, explosively imploding. The entity shattered into a massive cloud of dry, foul-smelling black ash that rained down over the grand staircase. The suffocating, freezing pressure in the house instantly vanished. The heavy, warm, humid air of the Georgia storm rushed back into the foyer. The silence that followed was the most beautiful sound I have ever heard in my entire life. I lay on the floor, bleeding, bruised, and gasping for air. Father Vance collapsed to his knees, clutching his crucifix, completely exhausted. Julian suddenly gasped loudly, his eyes snapping wide open. The sallow, gray color faded from his skin, replaced by the flush of living blood. He blinked rapidly, looking around the destroyed foyer in absolute confusion. "Mother." Julian stammered, his voice weak and trembling. What happened? Why am I in Savannah? I was just boarding a plane." He had no memory of the trance. He had no memory of the flight. The demonic influence had completely wiped his mind. I sobbed, pulling myself off the floor, and wrapped my arms around my son, holding him tighter than I ever had in my life. And then, from the top of the stairs, we heard a small, whimpering sound. Julian and I looked up. Evelyn was sitting on the steps, her white nightgown torn and covered in ash. The terrifying, dead, vacant look in her eyes was completely gone. She looked confused. She looked terrified. She looked down at her hands, trembling violently. And then, she opened her mouth. The deep, metallic, dual voice of the black tongue was gone. When she spoke, her voice was high-pitched, fragile, and utterly heartbroken. "Mommy." Evelyn sobbed, pulling her knees to her chest and rocking back and forth. "Mommy, where are you? I'm scared. I want to go home. I want my mommy." Father Vance slowly walked up the stairs, looking down at the weeping woman with profound, devastating pity. "She is gone, Eleanor," Vance whispered, his voice thick with sorrow. "The entity is destroyed." "But, why is she talking like that?" Julian asked, stepping forward, completely bewildered. "Evelyn, sweetheart, it's me. Evelyn shrank away from him, crying harder. "Who are you? Don't touch me. I want my mommy. I'm 5 years old. Please." The horrifying truth crashed over me like a tidal wave of ice water. Silas had possessed her when she was a 5-year-old girl playing in the woods. The demon had completely hijacked her consciousness, trapping her mind in a state of suspended animation while it used her body to live its own sick, vengeful life for 20 years. Evelyn had never loved Julian. Evelyn had never agreed to marry him. Evelyn had been a prisoner in her own flesh, locked in the dark since she was a toddler. And now that the demon was dead, she had woken up. She was a 25-year-old woman with the mind, the memories, and the absolute terror of a 5-year-old child who had just woken up from a very long, very dark nightmare. The tragedy of it was absolute. Julian was devastated. He annulled the marriage, paying for Evelyn to be placed in a highly specialized, private psychiatric care facility in upstate New York, where she could be rehabilitated and cared for safely. The doctors called it extreme dissociative amnesia. We knew the truth. Blackwood Manor was heavily renovated. We replaced the chandelier, fixed the floors, and washed the black ash from the walls. But some stains never truly come out. I still live in the manor. The air is warm again, and the smell of the swamp stays outside where it belongs. But I have learned a terrifying, inescapable lesson about the nature of evil. We fear the monsters that hide under the bed, or the ghosts that haunt the graveyard. We fear the things that look like demons. But the most terrifying evil in this world is the kind that hides in plain sight. It is the evil that wears a beautiful face, that sits at your dining room table, and smiles at you while it slowly, methodically plans to take everything you love. And sometimes, when the house is completely quiet, I catch myself staring at the antique grandfather clock in the foyer, waiting to hear the sound of a second voice whispering in the dark. Because I know now that the devil doesn't stay in hell. Sometimes, he puts on a white dress, and he asks to be invited inside.